The ordinary day that changes everything. The plate shattered before it hit the floor, its echo cutting through the restaurant like a thunderclap. And for a long moment, no one breathed. Edward Malone stood behind the counter, his hand trembling, a streak of gravy dripping from his wrist like blood. "I said we're closed," he barked, his voice raw from hours of shouting orders, exhaustion, and something darker: loneliness. The couple standing in the doorway didn't move. They looked worn down by the rain, their faces pale under the amber glow of the ceiling lights. The man's coat dripped steadily onto the old oak floor, and the woman's hands clutched a small purse against her chest as if it were the last thing she owned. "Please," the woman said softly, her voice trembling. "We've been on the road for hours. We just need a warm meal, any meal. We'll pay, I promise." Edward's jaw clenched as the clock above the register ticked toward 10. "The kitchen's closed," he growled again, wiping his hands on a towel that smelled of onion and regret. "You people think you can just stroll in whenever you feel like it? This isn't a charity." The man stepped forward slightly, keeping his tone calm but firm. "Sir, it's pouring outside. We haven't eaten since morning. You could at least let us sit down." That last line set something off inside Edward. Maybe it was the tone, or maybe it was the fact that the man's eyes, clear, steady, without fear, reminded him of a time when he still cared about fairness, decency, kindness. But that man was gone now, buried under years of unpaid bills, a crumbling marriage that ended in a hospital bed, and a son who hadn't called in 3 Christmases. He slammed the towel down. "Out," he snapped. "Before I call the cops." The woman's lips parted slightly as if she couldn't believe what she'd just heard. For a second, she looked like she might cry, but instead she nodded, reached for her husband's arm, and whispered something that made Edward's stomach twist, even though he couldn't hear it. The two of them turned and stepped back into the storm. As the door swung shut behind them, the bell above it gave a tired little ring, and the restaurant fell silent except for the hum of the old freezer and the wind howling outside. Edward stood there staring at the empty doorway, his chest tight, his breath uneven. He told himself they were probably drifters, people who would have eaten and left without paying. He told himself he'd done the right thing, but deep down, he knew that wasn't true. Was that really necessary? Came a voice from the corner. It was Lily, his waitress, wiping down the last of the tables. She was in her 30s, sharp-tongued but kind, the only person left who hadn't given up on him completely. She looked up at him with tired eyes that saw straight through his excuses. "They looked hungry, Ed. You could have just—" "Don't start," he cut her off, though his voice had already lost its fire. "They shouldn't have come this late. They didn't deserve that," she said, shaking her head. "You used to be different." Her words stung because they were true. He remembered a time when his late wife, Margaret, used to serve soup to strangers who couldn't afford it, saying kindness was never wasted. But Margaret was gone and kindness didn't pay rent. After she left for the night, Edward locked up, turned off the neon sign, and stood alone in the dim light of the kitchen. Rain streaked down the window like tears on glass. He poured himself a whiskey, stared at his reflection in the metal counter, and muttered, "People take advantage, that's what they do." But even as he said it, he couldn't shake the look on that woman's face, the quiet disappointment, the calm before she'd walked out. He lay awake that night listening to the storm, replaying the sound of her voice the way she'd said, "Please." It wasn't the word that haunted him, it was the way she'd said it with a kind of quiet dignity, as if she already knew what he'd do and had forgiven him for it before he did it. The next morning, Edward came downstairs early, unlocked the door, and stepped out to find the rain had washed everything clean except his conscience. A folded napkin lay on the doorstep, soaked but legible, with a few words written in faded ink. "You'll regret this, Mr. Malone." He stared at it, heart pounding, unsure if it was a threat or a prophecy. Either way, it was true, because by the time he learned who that couple really was, his life and his soul would never be the same again. Whispers of regret and the past. By morning the storm had moved out to sea, but the heaviness it left behind clung to the town like fog. Edward Malone stood behind the counter of Malone's Grill, polishing a coffee pot that no longer shined. His eyes were rimmed red from lack of sleep. Every time he closed them, he saw that napkin, those 5 words bleeding through the paper as if they'd been written in truth instead of ink. You'll regret this, Mr. Malone. Lily came in early, her hair damp from the morning mist. She took one look at him and sighed. You didn't sleep, did you? He didn't answer. He just kept scrubbing the coffee pot until his reflection blurred into the metal. You saw that napkin too, didn't you? She asked, her tone soft but sharp. Who leaves something like that? Edward shrugged, trying to appear unaffected, but his shoulders betrayed him, heavy and hunched. People like to stir trouble, he muttered. Could have been a joke. Jokes don't feel like that, Lily said quietly. I saw that woman's eyes before they left. That wasn't anger, that was something else. Edward didn't want to talk about it, but the restaurant had its own way of talking. The town had its own way too. By noon, word had spread faster than the morning fog. Someone from the diner across the street had seen the whole thing. The couple begging for food, Edward turning them out like stray dogs. By afternoon, he heard whispers from regulars pretending not to stare. They still ate there, but their voices carried judgment with every clink of a fork. He tried to shake it off, tried to focus on the sizzle of bacon and the comfort of routine. But that evening, a reporter from the Baytown Chronicle walked in, a young man barely 30, notebook in hand, polite but persistent. Mr. Malone, he began, I heard about what happened last night. Folks online are calling it cruel. Some even say the couple might have been passing through for charity work. Any comments? Edward's face hardened. No comment, he said. I don't feed gossip. The reporter smiled thinly. Funny because that's what feeds business in this town. He left his card on the counter and walked out, leaving Edward staring at the name, Daniel Reed. The man's confidence irritated him, but beneath that irritation was a growing fear. Fear that his one impulsive act might not stay a secret for long. By the next morning, things had changed. The regulars who'd once greeted him with jokes and small talk now kept their voices low. Someone had taken a photo of the couple standing outside in the rain, the restaurant sign glowing behind them like a cruel witness. The headline in the Chronicle read, Local restaurant owner turns away elderly couple during storm. Edward tore the newspaper in half, but it didn't matter. The story was already alive, breathing in whispers and side glances. That afternoon, a man from the bank stopped by, not for food, but to remind him that his loan renewal was still pending. Times are tough, the man said kindly, and bad press doesn't help, Ed. That night, Edward walked home alone through the drizzle, his shoes slapping the wet pavement. The windows of other restaurants glowed warm with laughter, and he felt the distance between himself and the world stretching wider than it had ever been. When he reached his house, he paused on the porch and looked back toward Malone's grill, its sign flickering in the dark like a heartbeat about to stop. Inside, he poured himself another drink and sat by the fireplace, staring at the framed photo of his late wife, Margaret. Her smile was gentle, timeless. You'd hate what I've become, he whispered. You'd say I lost the man you loved. His voice cracked. Maybe I did. A knock at the door made him jump. He opened it to find no one, just an envelope on the step sealed and unmarked. His name was written in elegant handwriting. Inside was a single folded page with neat, deliberate words. Everyone deserves a second chance, Mr. Malone. We'll see if you do. His heart raced. No signature, no return address. He stepped outside, scanning the street, but there was only fog rolling off the harbor, thick and silent. He looked up the road, certain he saw a shadow move near the lamppost, but when he blinked, it was gone. The next morning, the restaurant door was already unlocked when he arrived. He was sure he'd locked it the night before. Inside, everything was untouched except one thing. The napkin with those same 5 words now sat on the counter again, completely dry. He froze. Lily, he called, his voice trembling slightly. No answer. He reached out, fingers brushing the napkin, and felt a chill spread up his arm that had nothing to do with the weather. Whoever the couple was, they hadn't just left, they were watching. And for the first time in years, Edward Malone realized he wasn't in control anymore. The mysterious return. 3 days passed, and the air inside Malone's grill felt heavier than the grease that clung to the walls. Edward tried to keep up appearances, but the restaurant had gone quiet. The regulars still came, though fewer with each passing day, and when they did, their conversations hushed as soon as he walked by. Rumors were spreading. Some said the couple had been philanthropists, others said they were journalists investigating mistreatment of the homeless. One woman swore she saw the same man driving through town in a black car late at night. Edward laughed it off in front of them, but the laughter died fast once he was alone. Each night he sat in his office staring at that napkin he couldn't bring himself to throw away. He'd placed it in a drawer beside his wife's old recipes as if part of him knew it belonged with memories that wouldn't fade. On the fourth day, just before closing, Lily came rushing in from the dining area. "Ed," she said, breathless. "You need to see this." He followed her out, expecting another broken dish or customer complaint. But when he looked through the rain-streaked window, his stomach dropped. A sleek black car was parked across the street. Expensive, polished, the kind that didn't belong in their town. Inside, two figures sat in the front seats, unmoving. The man's silhouette was unmistakable, his posture calm and upright. The woman beside him seemed to be watching the restaurant, though Edward couldn't see her face through the misted glass. "They've been there for 10 minutes, Lily whispered. "Do you think it's them?" Edward didn't answer. He simply wiped his hands on his apron, forcing his breathing to slow. "Probably lost," he muttered, but he didn't believe it. When he finally turned away, he caught a faint reflection of himself in the window, older, heavier, and smaller than he remembered. The bell above the door rang. Every head in the restaurant turned as the same couple stepped in, calm and composed as if they'd never left. The man, Michael Dawson, offered a courteous smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Good evening, Mr. Malone," he said, his voice deep, steady, controlled. "We were hoping your kitchen might still be open tonight." Edward's throat went dry. He didn't know what to say. Clara, the woman, stood beside her husband in a beige coat that shimmered faintly under the lights. She met Edward's gaze without blinking, her expression unreadable, neither angry nor forgiving. Lily froze near the counter. "I thought you said, 'It's fine,'" Edward cut her off quickly. "We'll make an exception." The couple exchanged a glance, then followed him to the best table by the window. Edward tried to focus, tried to act normal, but his mind was spinning. Were they here for revenge? To humiliate him publicly? To make good on that letter's cryptic promise? He handed them menus with trembling hands. "Tonight's roast chicken is special," he said, forcing a smile. Michael nodded. "We'll have that then. 2 plates," he paused. "And I'd like to speak with you before we leave. Mr. Malone, if you don't mind." The words were polite, but the tone was weighted, like a gavel about to fall. Edward retreated to the kitchen, his heart pounding. Lily followed, whispering, "Ed, this is strange. Why are they back? What do they want?" "I don't know," he muttered. Just cook." As the meal cooked, Edward peeked through the small service window. Michael sat with an elegance that felt out of place, the kind of composure that comes from money and confidence. Clara stirred her tea slowly, her eyes fixed on the rain outside, but every now and then, she turned toward the counter as though she could see him hiding there. When he brought out the food, the aroma of rosemary and garlic filled the air. They ate quietly, politely, complimenting the seasoning, the presentation, and the tenderness of the chicken. There was no trace of resentment, only precision, like they were testing him. Then Michael placed his fork down and looked up. "You've been running this place a long time, haven't you?" 30 years, Edward said cautiously. "That's rare these days," Michael replied. "Consistency, tradition, though sometimes those same things can trap a man." Edward frowned slightly. "You mean routine?" "I mean guilt," Michael said softly, cutting a piece of chicken. "We all get trapped by it sooner or later." Clara looked at her husband briefly, then at Edward. Her eyes were calm but deep, like water hiding something heavy beneath. "I once believed people don't change," she said. "Now I'm not so sure. Sometimes it takes losing everything to find what was lost." Edward didn't know how to respond. Her words struck something in him, a feeling he'd tried to bury. The moment he'd stopped caring, the day Margaret had died, and he'd shut the world out with her. He forced a chuckle, masking discomfort. "Well, I suppose we've all lost something." When they finished, Michael stood and adjusted his jacket. "Mr. Malone," he said, "we'll be back tomorrow. There's something we'd like to discuss in private. It's business." Before Edward could ask what kind, Clara set a crisp $100 bill on the table. "For the trouble," she said. He stared as they walked out into the rain, their car disappearing into the dark. Lily turned to him, wide-eyed. "Business with them? What does that mean?" Edward swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know, but I think it's just beginning." That night, long after closing, he found a single folded paper tucked beneath the napkin in his office drawer. It wasn't there before. This time it didn't say, "You'll regret this." It said, "We were invited once, and you said no." The dinner of truth. The next evening arrived with a storm that felt different from the last. The wind howled through the alleyways like something alive, and the rain hammered the windows of Malone's grill in relentless rhythm. Edward had lit candles on the tables, hoping to disguise the flickering lights that kept dimming with each rumble of thunder. The place looked warm and alive from the outside, but inside Edward felt cold. His hands wouldn't stop trembling. He told himself it was just business, when whatever the couple wanted, he'd handle it. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. Something about their calm, their deliberate return, the cryptic note left in his office. It all felt orchestrated, as if every step had been planned long before they'd ever walked into his restaurant. At precisely 7 o'clock, the black car pulled up again. The headlights cut through the rain, illuminating the front door for a heartbeat before going dark. When Michael and Clara stepped inside, they brought the storm with them. Not in wet coats or dripping umbrellas, but in the quiet tension that seemed to fill every corner of the room. "Mr. Malone," Michael greeted smoothly, shaking off his coat. "I appreciate you seeing us again. We thought it best to talk after hours." Edward nodded stiffly, his voice rough. "You mentioned business. What kind?" Michael smiled faintly. A businessman's smile, polite and unreadable. "Let's have dinner first. Then we'll talk." They took the same table by the window. Lily, who had insisted on staying late despite Edward's protests, hovered nervously by the counter. She didn't trust them, that much was obvious, but her loyalty to Edward kept her there. As Edward served their meal, Clara's eyes followed his every movement. There was no hostility in her expression, but something heavier. Knowledge, perhaps, or memory. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and even. "You built this place with your wife, didn't you?" The question hit like a spark in dry tinder. Edward froze, the tray trembling slightly in his hands. "Yes," he said after a pause. "A long time ago." Clara nodded slowly. "She must have been a remarkable woman." "She was," Edward replied quietly, his throat tightening. "The best person I ever knew." For a moment, silence filled the space between them, broken only by the rain tapping against the glass. Then Michael leaned back in his chair, studying Edward with the kind of gaze that felt like an X-ray. "Tell me, Mr. Malone," he said, "do you ever think about how easily a single act can undo a lifetime of work?" Edward's eyes flicked up sharply. "What are you getting at?" Michael set down his fork, his expression calm but his tone precise. "We travel a lot. We visit places like yours, family businesses struggling but proud. Some deserve saving, others don't." He leaned forward. "We decide which is which," Lily frowned. "Are you investors?" Michael smiled. "Something like that." The room felt smaller now, the air too thick. Edward tried to keep his voice steady. "And what did you decide about us?" "That," Clara said softly, "depends on you." The words sank into him like ice. He glanced between them, trying to read their faces. "What do you want from me?" Clara didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked around the restaurant, her gaze lingering on the old photographs of Margaret on the wall, her smile frozen in another life. Finally, Clara said, "Your wife once showed kindness to a stranger when she had nothing to give. Do you remember that?" Edward's chest tightened. "She helped a lot of people." "Yes," Clara said, her eyes glistening. "Including me." The fork slipped from Edward's hand and clattered against the plate. He stared at her, speechless. "I was 19, Clara continued, her voice trembling now. Homeless, frightened. I came into this restaurant one night begging for food, and she gave me a meal, a blanket, and a promise that I could come back any time. She said kindness costs nothing. It's the only thing that grows when you spend it." Edward's throat went dry. His knees felt weak, and for the first time in years, tears burned behind his eyes. "You were that girl," he whispered. "Margaret told me about you. She said you vanished after that night." "I left to start over," Clara said softly. "And I never forgot her. She saved my life. I just wanted to see what became of the man she loved so much." Michael reached into his coat pocket and placed something on the table, a folded photo. Edward unfolded it slowly, and his breath caught. It was a picture of Margaret standing beside Clara, younger but unmistakable, her hand resting gently on the girl's shoulder. "She talked about you even when she was sick," Edward said, voice breaking. "She said she hoped you were safe." Clara's lips trembled, but she didn't cry. "I was, because of her. That's why we came here, not to punish you, Mr. Malone. To see if her kindness survived you." The room went silent except for the sound of thunder rolling outside. Edward lowered himself into a chair, unable to stand any longer. "I failed her," he whispered. "I failed at everything she stood for." Michael's voice softened, but there was steel beneath it. "Maybe. Or maybe this is your second chance." Before Edward could respond, the restaurant lights flickered, once, twice, and went out completely. The storm outside roared louder, as if the night itself was listening. In the faint candlelight, Edward saw something new, another envelope on the counter by the register, placed there when no one was looking. Clara turned toward it, her face pale. "We didn't put that there," she said. Edward rose slowly, heart pounding, and opened the envelope with shaking fingers. Inside was a photograph, not old, but recent. It showed Michael and Clara standing outside Malone's grill 2 nights ago, staring up at the sign. But in the reflection of the glass door behind them, a third figure stood watching from inside, and it wasn't Edward. The hidden connection. The candlelight flickered wildly, shadows crawling up the walls like living things. Edward stared at the photograph in his trembling hands, the air thick with dread. There it was, his restaurant door, the rain falling in silver streaks, and the unmistakable reflection of a woman standing behind the glass. Her face was blurred by motion, but there was something hauntingly familiar about the silhouette, the way the hair curled at the shoulders, the faint tilt of the head. For a long moment no one spoke. Even the storm outside seemed to pause, holding its breath. Michael leaned forward, his voice measured but sharp. "Who else has keys to this place, Mr. Malone?" "No one," Edward said, though his voice faltered. "Just me. And Lily." Clara's eyes darted toward the dark hallway leading to the back room. "Where is she now?" Edward swallowed hard. "She went home an hour ago." But even as he said it, something in him hesitated. Had she? He thought he'd heard the door earlier, a faint click like someone leaving quietly. But he'd been so distracted by the conversation he couldn't be sure. Michael stood, his expression no longer polite. "This isn't random. Someone's playing with you." Edward's gaze dropped back to the photo. The reflection's outline grew sharper in his mind until his stomach twisted in disbelief. "It can't be," he whispered. "What?" Clara asked softly. He raised his eyes to her. "That shape, that stance. It looks like Margaret." The name hung between them like thunder. For a second, Clara looked stricken. "Your wife?" Edward nodded, barely breathing. "She's been gone 8 years, cancer. I buried her myself." Michael crossed his arms, skeptical but not dismissive. "Then someone's using her image. Maybe an old photo, digitally altered." But Edward shook his head. "No, look at the angle. Look at the reflection. That's here, that's real." A gust of wind slammed against the windows, rattling the glass. The power flickered again, plunging the room into near darkness except for the glow of the single candle between them. Edward's pulse thudded in his ears. "I don't understand," he muttered. "Why would anyone do this?" Clara reached across the table and touched the edge of the photograph with trembling fingers. "Maybe it isn't about revenge," she said quietly. "Maybe it's about reminding you of something you buried." Her words struck him harder than the storm. He rose from his chair, pacing. "Reminding me? I've done nothing but remember. Every day in this place is a memory of her." "Then why does it feel like you're running from her?" Clara asked softly, her gaze unwavering. Edward stopped cold. He wanted to shout, to tell her she didn't know what she was talking about. But the truth pressed against his ribs, sharp and undeniable. He had stopped coming to Margaret's grave years ago. Too painful, too filled with guilt for not being able to save her, for watching her die while the restaurant swallowed their final days together. He'd hidden behind his anger because it was easier than grieving. Michael picked up the envelope and studied the paper. "This wasn't here before," he said. "Someone came in while we were talking. Someone who knows you." Edward turned toward the back door. It was slightly ajar, swaying with the wind. "Stay here," he said, and before they could stop him, he moved into the darkness. The kitchen smelled of rain and gas and cold metal. His footsteps echoed softly. "Lily?" He called out, but only the storm answered. Then faintly a whisper, a woman's voice delicate as air. "Eddie." He froze. His heart slammed in his chest. Nobody had called him that since Margaret. He turned slowly toward the sound, his breath catching. The hallway light flickered once, and for a brief second he saw her, or thought he did. A figure in the reflection of the stainless steel refrigerator door, standing just behind him. Her outline glowed faintly in the candlelight, her hair brushing her shoulders the way it used to when she was alive. He spun around. Nothing. The door slammed shut, making him stumble back. "Who's there?" he shouted, but his voice broke. The reflection was gone. Only the echo of his own ragged breathing remained. When he returned to the dining area, Clara was pale. "We heard you shouting," she said. Edward could barely speak. "She's here," he whispered. "I saw her." Michael's jaw tightened. "You're in shock, that's all. Someone's manipulating you, using your memories against you." But Clara wasn't so sure. Her eyes glistened with something between fear and empathy. "Edward, what if it isn't punishment? What if it's forgiveness trying to find you?" He looked at her hollow-eyed. "Forgiveness doesn't haunt people." "Maybe it does," she said softly. "Until they learn to accept it." Thunder rolled again, shaking the windows. Edward sat heavily, clutching the photograph. "You said you travel, that you help failing businesses. Why come here? Why me?" Michael exchanged a look with Clara, and for the first time, hesitation flickered across his face. "Because," he said quietly, "Margaret asked us to." Edward's blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" Clara's voice trembled. "Before she died, she wrote letters to people she'd once helped, people she trusted. I was one of them. She asked that if you ever lost your way, I would come back here and remind you who you were." Edward's world tilted. "You mean this, everything was planned?" Clara nodded slowly. "Planned by love, not cruelty." "But the photograph—" "That wasn't us." Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the restaurant in stark white for a split second, and through the front glass they all saw it. A woman standing across the street in the rain looking in. Her shape was unmistakable, and when the lightning faded, she was gone. Redemption and revelation. The storm passed some time before dawn, but the silence it left behind was heavier than the thunder had been. The streets glistened under the first pale light, and Malone's grill stood quiet, its windows fogged and candles burned down to stubs. Edward sat in the corner booth, the untouched photograph spread before him, his hands clasped as if in prayer. He hadn't slept. Neither had Michael or Clara. They sat nearby, the three of them bound by fear, curiosity, and something that felt like destiny. When Lily arrived at sunrise, she froze at the sight of them. "You're still here?" she asked, her voice wary. "What happened last night?" Edward looked up, his eyes hollow but calm. "Lily," he said softly, "where were you after closing?" She frowned. "I told you, I went home. Did you come back?" Her confusion deepened. "No, why would I?" He reached for the photograph, sliding it across the table. "Then how do you explain this?" Lily's eyes widened as she stared at the image. The reflection in the restaurant door, the shadowy figure standing behind the glass. For a heartbeat, she looked terrified. Then she pressed a hand to her mouth and whispered, "Oh God, that's Margaret." The air in the room seemed to still. Michael leaned forward. "You see it too?" Lily nodded, trembling. "I saw her once before. About a week ago, late at night. I thought I was imagining things. I came to drop off inventory papers and saw someone standing in the kitchen window. I swear it was her." Edward's breath hitched. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you'd have said I was crazy. And maybe I am. But it felt like she was waiting for something." Clara's voice was soft but certain. Maybe she was waiting for this moment. Edward rubbed his face, his voice breaking. "I don't understand any of this. Letters, photographs, visions, what does it mean?" Michael took a deep breath. "Margaret knew she was dying long before she told you, Edward. She wrote Clara a letter asking her to come back one day, yes, but she wrote another, one that you never received." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, time-worn envelope. "We found this among Clara's old things a month ago, sealed and addressed to you. It was never mailed. Margaret must have given it to someone who never delivered it." Edward's hands shook as he opened the envelope. The handwriting hit him like a memory of sunlight. My dearest Eddie, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone and you're still fighting shadows. I know how you are. You'll build walls of anger to protect yourself from the pain. But don't, love. Let it hurt. Let it break you if it must, because that's how the light gets in. Promise me one thing. When a stranger comes to your door in need, you'll open it, because one day that stranger will carry me back to you. The words blurred through his tears. He pressed the letter to his chest as a sound escaped him, part sob, part prayer. Clara wept quietly, her hands folded. She knew, she whispered. She knew we'd find you when you needed it most. Edward stood slowly, walking toward the front window where the first rays of morning lit the street. The reflection staring back at him wasn't the bitter man he'd become. It was the man Margaret had loved, softened, human again. I turned them away, he said hoarsely, and somehow she turned back to bring them here. Lily approached carefully. What do we do now? He turned to her with a steadiness she hadn't seen in years. We open, and we never close our doors again. By noon, the restaurant buzzed with new life. Michael made phone calls while Clara met with a local reporter, turning last week's scandal into a story of redemption. The man who found his kindness again. Donations poured in. People offering to eat, volunteer, rebuild. But what struck Edward most wasn't the customers or the attention. It was the quiet moments, when he'd look up from the counter and think he saw her just for a second, standing by the kitchen door with that familiar smile. Weeks passed. The grill transformed into something more than a business, part restaurant, part refuge. A sign hung by the entrance. No one leaves hungry. And beneath it, a framed photo of Margaret with a small brass plate that read, "In memory of kindness." One evening, as the sun dipped low, Clara and Michael came for one last dinner before returning home. After dessert, Clara touched his arm gently. You kept your promise to her. Edward smiled through misty eyes. No, Clara. She kept hers. When they left, he stood alone in the quiet restaurant, the smell of coffee and warm bread filling the air. The light above the counter flickered once, not harshly but softly like a wave goodbye. He looked up, smiling faintly. I know, he whispered. I finally understand. Outside, the wind carried the scent of the ocean, gentle and forgiving, and as he locked the door for the night, the reflection in the glass caught a faint shimmer, the outline of a woman's hand resting over his, then fading like mist in the morning sun. Edward didn't look startled this time. He simply nodded, whispered thank you, and turned out the lights because some doors, once opened by kindness, never truly close. Final line. Emotional. Cinematic closure. The night Edward Malone threw kindness out his door was the night love found its way back in, to remind him that even the coldest heart can be warmed again, if it dares to open.